Welcome to CEC Gurukul Live. Today we shall be talking about assessment for improving learning. That means we shall be discussing that how teachers should be assessing in their class so that the learning of the students can be improved. In today's talk we shall be covering first basics of assessment and evaluation, then we shall also be dealing with tools and strategies of assessment and using the results of assessment for improving learning. So, today we shall be dealing basically with how to improve learning by assessing our students. So, friends, as a teacher, as all of us know that it is our primary duty to assess the students along with teaching them how to become good learners. This is a primary duty not only of the teachers, but also of the educational administrators and parents. So, time to time the teacher is either conducting her own tools, that is called teachers prepared test, or we have the evaluation parameters set by various agencies on annual and monthly basis as to evaluate students so that the learners come out to be the best score. So, it is our being a primary duty of our teachers. So, we shall be knowing that how we shall be assessing, how we should be creating basic tools as to assess our students, and what are the basic parameters we shall be judging for the students as to assess them whether they have been able to get the learning as we expected outcome we had when we started our lesson. Because whenever we start our lesson, as all of us know that whenever we go for a lesson plan, then we usually have the learning objectives. So, as to find out that whether those learning objectives have been achieved as teachers by us, we have to assess our students. Whenever we talk about the evaluation, as I have already told you that we shall also be talking about the tests which are created by the teachers, and we shall also be covering the various kind of examinations which are being conducted by other agencies as to evaluate students and how we decide the parameters. So, we shall also be discussing the blueprint of the question paper, and apart from that we shall also be discussing the other tools like the observation method, the not just the questionnaire, but also interview schedule, the case studies. They are also the kind of evaluation we conduct as to find out that whether the learning objectives have been achieved as far as students are concerned or not. So, these are the parameters to rate the performance of the students. Friend, as to understand whether the students have been able to learn it, it is not just the examination which are the parameter as to find out whether the students have learned what they were expected to do or not. So, marks and grades are to be finalized so that we understand in the best possible manner that the students have been able to learn the maximum. Now, usually the question arises, and the students also question, as a teachers also we try to find out, and this is a question which remains in mind of almost each one of us, that whether the examination, whether the test being conducted by us really find out that whether the student has learned or not. So, this is the question in today's lecture we will try to answer. Apart from that, we shall also try to answer the question that the learning style of the different students. Are we able to evaluate as per the learning style of different students? Is our evaluation parameters fitting the learning style of different students, and along with that are we fitting the individual differences of the students? So, these are the questions we will try to answer in today's lecture, and while answering these questions we shall also be covering the kind of difficulties teachers face during assessing the learning objectives as settled by them in the lesson plan. Friends, before deciding whether the assessment is able to justify the learning objectives, or we should say the learning behavior of the student, we should also try to concentrate on the fact that are the assessment procedure catering to strength and weaknesses of the students. Is the assessment procedure really deciding that the pace of a learning for each student is different? Are we assessing as per the different pace of learning for each student? Are we taking care of all the areas or aspects of the subject content along with the individual differences of the students, and most importantly that whether the are we not this is usually a question which is usually asked by the students, that scholastic abilities of the student, are they really enough to evaluate the fact that whether the student will be able to do good in his or her life. So, that means that we have to evaluate co-scholastic abilities also. That is why we said that apart from testing the student on the question paper, we shall also be employing other techniques like interview, the case studies, because these are also the techniques which allow us to evaluate or assess the co-scholastic abilities or competency of the students. One thing which should be, we all as students, as teachers, we should be knowing is that whenever we decide upon the assessment procedure of the which is taken by us, which is accepted by us for evaluating the student, then first thing is learning behavior which we have decided to assess, second the learning objective which we have decided to evaluate, third is the it should be as per the content which we have taught in our class. So, friends, assessment is not of the students, assessment is also of the fact that how far we have been able to do our best in the class. So, the assessment is not just for the student, assessment is also for the teacher. So, teacher after having assessing the student is able to usually find out that how to improve her teaching skill, so that the learning behavior is strengthened. That means, it is not finding the weaknesses of the student, it is also about finding our own weaknesses as teachers, so that the learning outcomes or learning behavior of the student improves further. One more thing which I would like to pinpoint is that usually what happens is that we are not able to have the appropriate parameters for evaluation. For example, if you are going for measuring rice, then you will go for kilogram. If you are going for measuring the liquid, then naturally it will be in liter or milliliter. So, accordingly the assessment procedure has to be suiting the required objective of the teacher. This is something which we should keep in mind while evaluating the student. Apart from that, of course, as we have talked about the individual difference, and we should also be seeing to it that if the student is not able to do well in one subject, that does not mean that the student is weak or the student has to be placed somewhere at the bottom of the class. No, the student has to be evaluated comprehensively, not just in the subject, but in all the subjects along with co-scholastic abilities, along with the co-curricular abilities, sports activities. So, the evaluation of the student, the assessment of the student is holistic, but assessment of the teacher is content related. So, whenever we assess in the class, what we are able to gather? We are able to gather that whether that content has gone well as far as learning behavior of the students is concerned, and how much we need to work upon that content as to make it better. So, as we have talked about that whenever we measure, then first thing is that the information should be there, but how should we place the information? This is most important. That means that whenever we decide upon the item of the question paper, what is item? Item is nothing but a question. So, item which might be carrying 1 mark, 2 mark, 5 mark, 3 mark, depending upon the information it is asking the student to give. So, item has to be decided in such a manner, one, it should be accurate. Accurate means that it should be asking about the accurate information. Secondly, it should be worded appropriately. Thirdly, it should be relevant. It should be contextual to whatever has been taught by the concerned teacher in her class. Only then you can say that the item has been appropriately decided by you. That means, whenever we decide upon an item, it has to be, content has to be placed in such a manner, the language has to be such that it should be understood by the student. So, when that is why whenever we decide a question or we decide an item, we go for the expert advice. What does experts do? Or we also go for the sampling as to find out that whether the item is valid and reliable or not. Well, what does expert do? Expert is able to advise the creator, the person who is deciding upon the items as to whether the item which he has or she has decided upon, that is really asking the relevant information, or is it asking for the valid information, or is it asking for the reliable information. What is validity? Validity means you are asking for the information which is what you are asking today, that would be asked tomorrow also. Only then you can say that the information being asked is valid. Reliable means how it is being read by one person, it should be read in the similar manner by the second person. That is why we have the validity test and reliability index as to find out that whether the items are appropriate or not. So, friends, we have talked about that how we have to decide the item. Items have to be decided as per their relevance to the context, to the content taught in the class. The items have to be placed in such a manner that they should be understood by the student as they are being written by the teacher. If they are communicating what is being aimed at, only then we can say that the item is fulfilling its objective. Thirdly, it should be valid and reliable. Friends, whenever we talk about the information, information can be qualitative and quantitative. Same is the case with the assessment. What do you understand by qualitative assessment or quantitative assessment? Quantitative assessment would mean that as per your parameter, that where you are placing that particular content. For example, if you have taught the adverbs in your class and you have asked the questions on adverb in your class, the result is that you find that out of 35 students, 15 have scored average marks. For example, you gave them a question paper of 20 marks and 50% got 10 out of 20. 5% got more than 15 to 20, and 15, 16, 17, 18, and others had less than 10, that means less than 50%. So, that would show that qualitatively you need to improve the content delivery in the class. So, somewhere that means the teacher has failed in her objective to teach the grammar which she had aimed at. That means she will have to hold the class again. And quantitatively it will also show that only the understanding of the student is such that 50% of the student have understood on an average and 50% have understood either above average or below average. That means 25% who scored less than 10 marks out of 20, and and the 50% which scored 10 marks out of 20. That shows that the quantitatively also teacher needs to improve as far as the delivery of the content is concerned. That means the quantitatively also it is shown that the teacher need to improve upon it, and qualitatively will be decided upon by the level of the questions which you have placed in the questionnaire. If the questions were very simple in comparison to what was taught in the class, then naturally you would say the question paper, the quality of the question paper is of the lower level and it need to be improved. I hope it is clear to all of you that what is qualitative assessment and what is quantitative assessment. Quantitative assessment means that how far and what percentage of students have been able to do average, above average or below average. So, thereby with the help of statistical methods, by generating either bar, we would be able to identify that out of 30 in the class, how the students are placed as far as scoring in that question paper is concerned. That would show that the kind of a delivery which has gone in the class, whether it was above average or it was below average, or it was average. So, accordingly teacher can decide that whether she has to take up the topic or not, and qualitatively the assessment will decide that whether you are asking the questions as per the content which was delivered in the class. For example, if the if the adverb which was taught to class 10th or 11th and the kind of a question you are putting in the question paper are of the level of 5th or 6th, then naturally you would say that the tool which you have taken, the question paper which you have created is not qualitative and it has to be improved further. Even if the students have been scored, you may say out of 30, 29 students scored 19 or 20. That does not mean that you have done justice to the teaching of adverb. That only mean that the question paper was not appropriate and qualitatively your tool of assessment is of the lower level and needs to be improved. So, this is about the qualitative assessment and quantitative assessment. So, how do we decide all these questions? These questions are decided by the fact that are we really teaching what we aim at. That means the objective of the lesson plan, is it being addressed in our classroom? Secondly, whatever has been taught in the classroom, is the question paper set by you or the tool of assessment decided by you, is it really assessing what was delivered in the class? You have to assess what is being taught in the class. You do not have to assess what you think is appropriate or as per your own level. So, it has to be decided by the concerned teacher only, that are you really assessing what is being learned by the student. Second, second, the most important thing, that how will assessment help a teacher? Assessment will help a teacher that when the assessment provides you the score, then naturally as a teacher you will be able to decide that can there be some better way as to teach the student that particular content which was taught by you, so that the performance of the student can improve. So, this is clear to all of us that whenever we hold the assessment, what does it mean? Assessment mean it is smart. What is smart? Smart means the learning outcomes have to be specific, they have to be measurable, they have to be achievable, they have to be realistic, and they have to be time bound. So, let us attend to each word in this vocabulary. Let us begin with smart. T in smart, time bound. Time bound means that you have to decide that the content which you are putting in your question paper, is it being evaluated in the requisite time. That means, if you are deciding upon 2 hours for an examination as per the assessment tool, it is very much probable that the questions you are putting in may need 2 hour and 5 minutes, or they may just be completed in 1 hour and 30 minutes. So, both would say that you have not been able to in this smart, you have failed one objective, which is time bound. So, time bound means the time has to be as per the questions which have been decided by you. Realistic, what does realistic means? Realistic means that you should not be asking, for example, in the geography you have taught them about mountains. If you have taught them about mountains, you should not be talking about altitude. So, if the purpose of the class was basically only to understand about the basic geography, that is mountains, then naturally you should be sticking to only mountains. You should not be talking about the things which were not covered in the class. So, it has to be realistic. Then it has to be, thirdly, it has to be achievable. Achievable means that the questions are to be such that the student should be able to do it. It should not happen that the students are not able to achieve it. And what is measurable? Measurable means that the question has to be given some kind of value. Value means marks, and that marks have to be decided as per the information which is being requested or required by you in the item. And the last but not least, most important is specific. Specific, as we also initially talked about, that your language should be such that it should ask for, it should as a communicative tool, it should ask for the information which you aim at. And that means it has to be very specific as far as asking the information from the students is concerned. Now, whenever we decide upon learning outcome, usually it is said that we should avoid fractions. Why should we avoid fractions? Because if we are keeping the items, if we are keeping the items evaluation in fractions, then naturally it has to be such that you will have to increase the number of questions, because if you are keeping in fractions, the calculation will also become difficult whenever you will mark the questions, and then that would make the assessment for you difficult. And apart from that, the fraction also increase the complication for the teacher who is setting the question paper, because the totaling has to be done, and the blueprint usually creates problem if you are doing lot of fractions. So, fraction should be avoided, but if needed it may be used. And percentage of the content. Percentage means two things. One is that the percentage of the content being taught, like there are 5 chapters and we know that out of 5, third chapter is such that which requires a weightage of 25%, and there is probability that there might be a chapter of which only require your 5% weightage. So, that percentage has to be kept in mind whenever we set the question paper. That content in the question paper has to be decided as per the percentage of the weightage of the content as decided by the different agencies. Usually it is the CBSE which usually gives you that what percentage has to be given to what kind of content. Secondly, percentage of the question paper, whether it carries 18% or it is of 100% or it is of 20%. So, that also need to be kept in mind whenever we settle the question paper. So, whenever we decide upon assessment, there are two things. One, you have to decide upon the tool. Secondly, you have to create a tool in such a manner that it is smart, as we discussed already what smart is. Thirdly, you have to decide that the tool is reliable and the tool is valid as per the different parameters of the evaluator, not just you, but the other evaluator as well. And another important thing is that whenever you apply the tool in the classroom, whenever you plan and adopt that tool in the classroom, the most important is it has to be well planned. What does well planned means? Friends, for example, the students would be very sleepy after the lunch break. If you decide to have the test conducted in 7th or 8th period, then naturally there will be lot of hustle and bustle, and the students will also be tired by that time. So, all those factors, the biological clock, that situation, the lot of noise which is happening outside the class, all those things have to be kept in mind whenever you apply that test in the class. What is delivering the question paper is nothing but applying the test, because assessment is nothing but applying the different kind of test. Test may be either in the form of observation schedule, it might be in the form of interview schedule, it might be in the form of a questionnaire which you usually term as question paper, or if you have asked the students to come having done a case study, so the case study might be presented in the class. So, the time has to be decided by the teacher for assessing the tool has to be appropriate. The student has to be assessed for as far as his progress in learning only after you feel that the content which has been taught by you has gone so much so that it is appropriate time for you to evaluate. While assessing, there are 3 things which you have to decide in mind. One thing, how you apply that tool of assessment. Secondly, that whether you have delivered that amount of content which can be assessed appropriately. The content should not be more, that means that it should not become very heavy for the students, and content should also not be very less, that it become too easy for the students. So, accordingly you have to decide. So, classroom transaction, assessment of students for finding out that whether they have progress in the learning or not, and deciding the expected learning outcome are the parameters which you have to decide while assessing the students for your learning outcome. Friends, what does assessment means? Assessment means assessing for the learning outcome. Secondly, it is a tool as to measure what kind of learning has taken place in the class. So, assessment is very important in the classroom. It assesses the learning is like a cycle. The teacher has taught in the class, then the teacher has assessed in the classroom. After the teacher has assessed, then the teacher is able to find out that what further improvement is needed as far as learning of the student is concerned, and accordingly again the learning outcomes are decided, and again the learning behavior, the assessment for the learning behavior is done. So, learning is a cyclic procedure, one thing should be clear to all of us. Secondly, whenever we assess, we should have the first thing, we should have the clarity about the content, as we have already discussed. Then we should be knowing that what is the learning objective, accordingly the assessment has to be decided. Then after that, as we have already discussed, that we have to be smart while deciding the assessment tool, and the tool has to be valid and reliable. So, as we already discussed, that whenever we decide upon the tool of the assessment, the most important thing is that we should measure what we are expecting to measure. As I already give you an example, that if you are measuring some liquid, then that has to be in liter. Similarly, if you are measuring sugar, then it has to be measured in kilos. So, similarly the assessment should be suiting the objective and content which has been taught in the class. Another important thing whenever we assess a student is that the student's learning pace has to be kept in mind by the teacher, and the extent of learning which has taken place in the class should be kept in mind while assessing. Apart from that, the teacher should also be knowing that whenever there are learning outcome, are they appropriate for those students or not. That means, as we already taken the example of adverb. Adverb is something which is taught to class 3rd student as well as taught to class 11th and 10th student. So, it depends upon the level, and accordingly the assessment has to be done. So, the learning outcome for a student of class 11 would be different from the learning outcome which are expected of a class 3 student. And whenever we assess, the most important thing is that we should be assessing whatever has been taught in the class. So, classroom transaction is the most important thing. Another thing is that when we assess, we should assess not to find out the weaknesses of the student. This is, friends, very important thing, that we should be assessing not to find out or not to pinpoint weaknesses of the student. Assessment should be objective. Objective assessment means that we should be keeping in mind that not just the weaknesses of the student, but also strengths of the students are brought out in our assessment procedure. So, which tool would be called effective tool? The tool which provides the strength of the students as well as which mirrors the weaknesses of the students. Only that tool would be judged as being appropriate tool of assessment, because what is the basic objective of assessment? As to improve teaching learning which has gone into the class. Assessment can be formal or assessment can be informal. What is formal? Formal is, as we talked about, that formal is the kind of a exam which we hold in the session, like the annual exam, the semester's exam which we hold in the classroom, which we hold for the student. That is one way to assess the student. And what is informal? That after having taught some content in the class, then we ask few questions to the students and try to find out that whether the students have learnt the whatever was expected of them or not. And informal can also be the kind of simple observation. For example, the teacher has taught in the chemistry class, the teacher has taught what chemical composition of different thing is, and when the students are asked to go in the lab, then the teacher would be observing that how far she has been able to make the students understand the chemical composition of various thing, may it be the salt, may it be some other chemical. If the student is able to do the justice in the lab, then we can say that the interaction which happened in the class has been successful. So, assessment can be simple, the observation by the teacher. What happens whenever we give some case study to the students, what we are trying to assess? We are not just trying to assess whether the students have understood how to gather the information, we are also trying to assess that whether the student is able to decide upon the tool as to do a case study. For example, we have taught in a geography class that what are different kind of like there are primary, secondary and tertiary kind of occupation which are happening in our society, and then we ask the student to do a case study. One student is asked to do a case study on a primary occupation, another is asked to do on the tertiary occupation. One student who is going for a case study in primary occupation, he or she would be going and talking to some farmer, and here the teacher would be assessing for the kind of a question, the kind of a language the student is doing, the kind of a tool the student is deciding. For example, the child who is going to assess the person who is engaged in primary occupation would preferably take up interview schedule, and the student who is taking a case study of a person who is engaged in tertiary occupation might take up even a questionnaire, because the person who is engaged in a tertiary occupation, a service sector, then we expect that person to be educated enough to answer the question in the questionnaire, and apart from that he or she might be too busy to answer the questions during the interview. So, what we can do is we can provide the questionnaire to that person who is engaged in the tertiary occupation, and the person who is engaged in the primary occupation, he might not be so literate, not so educated to be able to answer the questionnaire. So, it is always better to have the observation schedule and the interview schedule for conducting a case study on a person engaged in primary occupation. If the students have understood those trivialities of these kind of case studies, only then we can say that we have been able to make the person understand, make the student understand not just the information he or she has to gather, also how to settle on the best tool as to find out the maximum information from the case study which he or she has taken up. So, as a teacher, it becomes responsibility of the teacher that she or he has to make the students understand not just how to gather the information whenever it comes to case study, but also how what to ask for. The information has to be appropriate, and it should be such that it should not reflect upon the person who is being interviewed or the questionnaire being addressed to the student, addressed to the person should not take it to be not fulfilling the objective. That means the vocabulary has to be appropriate. All those things have to be kept in mind. It should not happen that whenever the student is deciding upon the questionnaire, it has so many open-ended questions that the person who is trying to, even if the person really want to answer the questionnaire, then also the person may feel that it is very trivial, or the information being asked is too much and I do not have time, and the person might lose interest and may end up not answering all the questions, or might end up answering very few questions or less information which is which may not provide the person who is conducting the case study the exact information which he or she aimed at. So, friends, whenever we talk about the assessment has to be decided by the teacher. One thing apart from the content which has been delivered in the class, it has to be decided as per the age group and level of learning of the learner. So, these two things are to be kept in mind whenever you decide upon the tool of assessment. So, objective has to be very clear. What is objective? Objective is not just learning objective, but also the objective of assessing what is being assessed by the concerned teacher. So, accordingly the tool has to be decided. Then there are whenever we talk about assessment tool, then they can be basically divided into norm referenced and criterion referenced. What is norm referenced? Norm referenced means that we compare the student against the group norm. As usually whenever you have a look at the report card, what do you find? You find that it is stated that how many students have had A or how many students had B. If you will have a look at the parameter, if in class 10th or 12th, in your report card you will find that in English you might have scored only 85%, but still you might be having A written over there, because it is norm reference. That means the majority of the students have the 25% of the students who have scored more than 80, you are in that particular group. That is why you have been marked as A, and there is probability in the maths you have scored 90, but still you are at B plus. Reason being that the 25% of the students who were grouped as in that particular norm as being the brilliant have scored more than 92%. So, this is a kind of a norm referenced assessment which is done in the which is done by our examination agencies, and that is also done by the teachers in their class. Then there is criterion reference. What is criterion reference? Criterion reference means the students are compared with the desired performance. That means the student here has to score out of 100. When we say the percentage, what is that? That is criterion reference. 90%, 80%, 70%, 75%, that is criterion reference. That means student here is the performance of the student here is assessed against the desired performance. This is criterion reference. So, norm referenced and criterion referenced must be clear to you. Another thing which should be clear to you whenever we talk about the assessment is formative assessment. What is formative assessment? Formative assessment simply means that whether the procedure which is being employed is formal or informal assessment. As we talked about, that formal means having the test in the class, or informal would be just observing the students and accordingly decide that whether the learning activities of the students are there, that does it show that the behavior of the student, does it show that the students have been able to learn what was expected of them, that learning outcome have reached the students or not. If they need to be further improved, then naturally you have to have new learning objectives, and again in the classroom there have to be transaction, and on the basis of that again the assessment, and decide that whether the students have improved in the attainment or not. So, how does formative assessment help? Formative assessment is usually provides the teacher feedback as far as the student's knowledge is concerned. So, thereby the teacher is able to modify her teaching learning activities or experiences, and apart from that also provide the remedy classes. Usually whenever we ask the students to go for the remedy classes in language or in mathematics, why is it for, or why is it suggested? It is suggested on the basis of formative assessment. Formative, whenever we on the basis of a formative assessment we find out that the student may need to be given more help in that particular subject. How is it decided? It is usually decided on the basis of a criterion. For example, if you find that the student for complete year, after 3 months also the student has been able to performing below average on all the examination, during all the examination, may it be the class test or may it be the questions which are being asked by the student at the end of the chapter. That means the informal kind of assessment. Then also the teacher finds out that the learning of the student is below the level of the class as such. That means out of 30 students who are there in the class, there are 2 students who are not understanding what is being taught in the class. Then you can go for the remedial classes. So, the formative assessment helps the teacher to decide the remedial classes, the formative assessment also provides a feedback to the teacher that whether the student is improving or not. So, let us be very clear about the fact that what is the purpose of assessment. The purpose of the assessment is to recognize the potential of the student as also to facilitate them for enriching their capabilities. So, this should be clear to all the teacher, only then we would be able to finalize the best and appropriate tool for assessing the student, and also we would be able to assess the student appropriately in a smart manner. Formative assessment, fine, we are through with the formative assessment. After we are through with the formative assessment, then what is the next step of the teacher? After having assessed the student formatively, the teacher has to decide upon the remedial classes, or has to decide upon, at times it is also seen that the teacher decides that after having given remedial classes also the student is not able to improve, then the next step is that we should ask the family, ask the parents, ask the student to work on the strength, on his strength, and give up those things which he is not being able to improve. For example, if you find that for 2 or 3 years the student is not able to do good in mathematics, and he is required to give the retest of mathematics almost every year, then it is probable that we may ask the parents to take the student for evaluation as to find out that whether the student, the child may have some kind of a problem. Dysgraphia might be an issue with the child. So, if that after having evaluated the child for any kind of a special need, either we fulfill that special need of the child by providing remedial classes, and even if it is found that those special needs, after having fulfilled those special needs also, that student is not being able to do well, then naturally we can ask the parents to simply give up that subject in which the child is facing problem. So, assessment is basically for helping the student. Assessment is for strengthening the student. Assessment should not be taken in such a manner that it is for identifying the weaknesses of the student. Apart from that, whenever we assess, we also compare the student with his previous performance. Like if it is seen that in the first terminal the student has scored 30% only in that particular paper, in that particular subject. For example, let us take an example of social studies. We find that out of the class of 30, there are 5 students who attained 25 to 30% only in the social studies subject. Then the teacher will have to provide the remedial classes for that particular subject. If it is seen that after having remedial classes the students have shown some improvement in the subject, then naturally you can decide as to provide the more help to the student, so that the student is able to show further improvement in the second term and then the final term. So, assessment is also to decide that how to strengthen the student step by step, how to help the student as to improve himself step by step. So, that assessment also help in deciding to improve the self esteem of the child and bring him to the self learning. How can assessment bring the child to the self learning? Assessment can bring the child to the self learning by bringing him to that particular level at which he understands that by having some kind of a parameters, by doing more written work or studying for few more hours in the class or outside after the class, the child might be able to do better in that particular subject. Apart from that, if you ask the student, if you change the way of assessment, like it is usually seen that the student may not be able to do very well in the social, when it comes to social studies. If you will provide him ask him to answer the questions in the question paper, the child may not be able to do well. But if you ask the same child to go for a case study, the child may show the better learning behavior, and after that if you give him some kind of a test, then the child may be able to do better. So, accordingly, what are case studies? Case studies are a kind of a self learning mode. So, accordingly you can help the child to self learning as well as understand that intrinsic motivation, provide the intrinsic motivation to the child. When we were talking about the formative assessment, whenever we talk about the formative assessment, one thing has to be kept in mind, that whenever we decide upon a formative assessment, because it is teacher's work to decide the tool of assessment as well as to formulate that tool. So, whenever you formulate that tool, the evaluation or the assessment has to be built on students' prior knowledge or experience. So, how will that be decided? That would be decided on the fact that what has been taught by the concerned teacher in the class. And another important thing whenever we assess a child is that it has to be conducted at regular interval. And how to conduct at the regular interval? We can't have very many examinations during the academic calendar. So, what we can do is that we can have the assessment on informal basis. So, class test is a method which every teacher should adopt as to assess the child on the regular interval, and that really helps not only the child, but also the teacher as to understand that where diagnostic and remedial teaching is to be provided. So, this thing is very much relevant, that the assessment is formative. Another important thing whenever we decide upon the formative assessment is that the feedback has to be provided. What is feedback? Feedback means that you have to provide the feedback not only to the child, but also his or her parents, as to make them understand that how far the learning is going on. And if there are some kind of issues, then those issues have to be attended by the parent, teacher and the student together. So, this thing should be always kept in mind whenever you decide the tool of assessment, that the tool of assessment has to provide a kind of scope for improvement for the child, as well as the scope for working for the parent, and scope for teacher as to decide her learning outcome, and as to decide that how far the improvement is to be done in the classroom. Another important thing whenever we discuss formative assessment is that then the student's need has to be kept in mind. As a teacher, how do we keep the need of the students in mind? For keeping the need of the students in mind, we have to, one, it has to be as per the content. Secondly, it has to be as per the age group of the children. For example, if you are asking a 4-year-old toddler to be assessed on the basis of writing 1, 2, 3, then naturally you are not taking into consideration the fact that those toddlers of 3-year-old is not interested in writing. They find it very boring. So, they have to be assessed in a different manner. Like if you want to assess the toddler for whether they have understood the numeric ability, whether they have been able to understand the numeric ability in a way that they understand what is 1, what is 2, what is 3. What you can do is that you can have a kind of a game in the class, or you can just have some just bowls, have 10 bowls in the class and keep one bowl, and then ask the student how many. The student will be more than interested to say 1, and if you keep 2 bowls, then the student would say 2. So, these kind of activities would be appropriate for that age group. So, assessment has to be in accordance with the age group also of the children, and assessment has to be as per the content which has been taught in the class. That means, if you have not taught the toddlers of 3 years or 4 years that what is 1, 2, 3, and you ask them to tell you whether they are 4 bowls or 2 bowls or 3 bowls, then naturally you should not expect that. That would be very not feasible, not an intelligent option for a teacher. Another important thing is that the learning styles has to be kept in mind. What is learning style? as we gave an example of the toddler. So, the learning style of the person will vary as per one's age group, one. Second, as per the interest of the child, and as per the as per the learning behavior which has been the information which the person already has. So, these things have to be kept in mind, the learning style have to be kept in mind before assessing the child. Whenever we assess a student, that means that we are offering an opportunity to the student as to improve, as to work in that area, so that his or her performance is improved. So, that means the assessment should be used as to offer an opportunity to the student to improve their work, and it should be helpful, it should be supportive, and there should not be any kind of a comparison between the student. Then one more thing which we need to be clear about whenever we talk about the assessment, summative assessment. What is summative assessment? Summative assessment, that means we summarize that whether the development of the student at that particular time, what is ranking system, what is grading system. The grading system or ranking system usually tell the student or inform the student or the parent or the concerned teacher the point at which the student is at that point. As I gave you the example of English and mathematics, that despite the fact that the student has gained 85 marks out of 100 in English, he is rated as A category student in English, and the same student who has scored 85 in mathematics is graded as or ranked as B category. So, that is as per the why is it so? Because he or being summarized as per the learning, and that is also a kind of a norm reference and the criterion reference assessment. So, summative assessment is done as to understand that whether the learning objectives are being understood by the student or not. Another kind of assessment which should be kept in mind whenever a teacher decides upon is formative assessment. Formative assessment we have already dealt in great detail, and summative student means that it tells about the outcome, it tells about what is to be changed in the teaching method, so that the student improve. And as we have talked about the formative assessment means it tells that how far the teacher should the method to be changed, or you can understand that what teacher should be doing as to improve the learning in her classroom. So, friend, this was about the assessment. We will continue with the assessment further on in our next lecture. Thanks for today. And if you have any kind of a query, you can always email to us that query. Thank you.